Howdy, today on Flippin Science we're looking at diffusion, osmosis and transport. So the science understanding that we're going to look at is describe how substances move across the cell membrane passively using the concentration gradient. So we're going to talk about diffusion and osmosis. And we're going to compare diffusion and osmosis to active transport, which requires energy and moving against the concentration gradient. So if we look at this animation down here, we could see we had all the particles together in a high concentration, and over time they're moving to the rest of the space, which had a low concentration at the start. So that's called diffusion. Diffusion is where substances move from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. Osmosis is a similar process using water. So it uses water to balance out concentration. So if we look at our animation down here, over here we have a high sugar concentration, which is our green circles. So the water moves from one side of a semi-permeable membrane over to the other to try and dilute down the water. So the semi-permeable membrane allows water to pass through, but it doesn't allow the glucose to pass through. So because there's a higher concentration of glucose on this side, the water moves from the side without the glucose to that side to try and balance out the concentration. And that's what osmosis is. So with diffusion, imagine somebody sprays perfume in quite a large room. Now, right next to where they're spraying, there's a high concentration. On the other corner of the room, there'll be a low concentration. So over time, the perfume will move from the region of high concentration throughout the room until everybody can smell the perfume. So the person who's closest to the perfume that's sprayed at the start will smell it first, then someone a few meters away, and then finally someone at the other end of the room. That's diffusion. It doesn't require any energy for the process to happen other than the thermal energy that's already present in a room. So the movement of air around the room will move the perfume out all around the room. So this is similar to cells. So in cells you can get diffusion across a membrane in a similar way. So if you have a high concentration on one side of the membrane, a low concentration on the other, the substance that moves from high concentration to low concentration. So diffusion acts along what we call a concentration gradient. So if there's a high concentration on one side of a membrane and a low concentration on the other, the substances move from high concentration to low concentration. The greater the difference in concentration between one side of the membrane and the other, the greater the rate of diffusion. So if you have a really high concentration on one side and a really low concentration on the other, you're going to get fairly fast diffusion happening across the membrane. So this is called the concentration gradient. So if we're talking about cells, we're talking about diffusion normally between the intracellular space and the extracellular space. So the bit that's inside the cell versus the bit outside the cell. The diffusion occurs across the cell membrane, and that cell membrane is the semi-permeable membrane, which means some things can pass through but not everything can, so that's why it's semi-permeable. Like I said before, diffusion is a passive process, which means it doesn't require any energy from the cell for diffusion to occur. It's just the movement of the molecules that are around the substance. So here's some examples of some diffusions. So here we've got some dye on one side of a semi-permeable membrane. Over time, they've got a high concentration of dye on one side, a low concentration of dye on the other. The dye molecules will move through until we have an equal concentration on both sides. Down here we've just got two different solutes. So we've got a purple dye and a yellow dye. And again, we've got a high concentration of the purple on this side, a high concentration of the yellow on the other. And over time they diffuse until they mix. So in osmosis, you get a movement of a solvent, which is usually water in cells, across the membrane, and we call that osmosis. So we just need to get the terminology down. So a solvent is a substance that dissolves a solute, and together you have a solvent and a solute mixed together. That's called a solution. So we're looking at the movement of our solvent this time rather than the solute, which is what we were looking at in diffusion, for example. So in osmosis, we get a movement of water from low solute concentration to high solute concentration. So let's look at this picture down here. So in this picture we've got, on this left-hand side, we've got a very low concentration. We've got calcium, chlorine and magnesium ions. Then on the right-hand side we have a much higher concentration of calcium, chlorine and magnesium ions. So this side is 100 parts per million, this side is 1,000 parts per million. So in osmosis, the water moves, we're not looking at the movement of the ions. So the water is going to move from the left to the right-hand side to try and dilute out this side. So if we have more water over here, then we're going to get closer to an equal concentration on both sides of the semi-permeable membrane. Now, there's no agency again. This happens passively. There's no energy required for this process to happen. the water moves from low concentration to high concentration, and that acts to balance out the concentrations on either side of the semi-permeable membrane. So why is this important in biology? Well, both of these processes occur in cells. So cells that have low concentrations of water inside them will take in more water from outside the cell. So that's osmosis. So we have low concentration of water, which is the same as saying high concentrations of solutes. So water will come in via osmosis into cells. We can also get diffusion happening. So if you have a large amount of substance on one side of the semi-permeable membrane, in this case the cell membrane, they will diffuse through until you get equal concentrations on both sides of the membrane. Now this can be a problem for cells. So here we have some red blood cells. Here's some red blood cells. This is in a isotonic medium, means the same concentration on either side. So the red blood cell looks like a red blood cell. If we put it in a hypertonic solution, that means we're putting it in a very salty solution. That means the water comes from inside the cell through the cell membrane outside through osmosis. So the cell shrinks. If we put the cells in a hypotonic solution, that means very low concentration, then the water is going to come from outside the cell and go into the cell because we have a higher concentration of salts inside the cell than outside. That makes the cell swell. And this can be very bad because if this is your blood cell, if you inject, say, pure water into your body, pure water has a very low salt concentration, so that will cause red blood cells to swell, and they can burst. There's nothing to stop a cell membrane from bursting if there's too much water going inside the cell. Now, proteins are able to regulate this process, and we're going to talk about them shortly. So I talked about blood cells just before, so animal cells. Let's talk about plant cells. So in an isotonic solution, when you have the same amount of salt on either side of the membrane, water comes in and water comes out at the same rate, so we don't get the change in the cell size. If we go to a hypotonic solution, this is where there's a very low salt concentration, then the water comes from outside the cell in. And what that can cause to happen in plant cells is that water goes in and the cell swells. Now, because plant cells have a cell wall, that means they don't explode like animal cells do. So the cells get really puffy and really big, and a lot of that water goes into the large central vacuole. In a hypertonic solution, so if we put it in a really strong salt solution, the water will come from inside the cell out through osmosis. And when that happens, the cell inside shrinks, but again, the cell wall stays around about the same shape. So the water comes out, and again, that water can come out of the large central vacuole, and that causes the cell to shrink a little bit. So rather than having a turgid cell, we have a plasmolyzed cell, which means it's not as big as it could be if it's pumped full of water. So passive transport is where we get movement without requiring energy from the cell. This is diffusion and osmosis. So small molecules like oxygen and water has a bit of trouble, but we'll talk about water shortly. Small molecules can usually pass through the cell membrane relatively easily into the cell, and then other small molecules can pass out relatively easily as well. So carbon dioxide is a very small molecule. It can pass through the cell membrane out into the outside world, whereas oxygen is quite small, so it can pass in. So this process doesn't require any energy from the cell, and that's why we call it passive. In this animation down here, we're seeing what's called active transport. This is where the proteins in the cell membrane require energy from the cell to do their job. This is a sodium-potassium ion pump, and I've shown you this before. So in the sodium-potassium ion pump, ATP, we'll see, wait for it to reset, ATP down here provides energy to this protein to change shape. In this case, we're pumping out sodium ions and pumping in potassium ions. So the pumping out of the sodium ions requires energy, that changes the shape of the protein. The potassium ions come in, that releases the phosphorus, and then it changes back to the shape. So by doing this, we can get one coming out against the concentration gradient and one going in against the concentration gradient. So we're pumping something that wouldn't normally flow just through diffusion, we're pumping it against the concentration gradient into. So again, if we look at our numbers here, we've already got some sodium and some potassium on either side. We're pumping out sodium against the concentration gradient, so we get more sodium on this side, and we're pumping in potassium to this side so that we get more potassium on the inside. What would normally happen is if we have a high concentration of one on one side and low on the other, the ions would flow from high to low concentration through diffusion. Because we have this pump, we could maintain particular concentrations inside and outside the cell, which are different. Now this is a very important process. This happens in nerve cells. Nerve cells need to have a particular charge inside compared to outside, and that's how they transmit information, by changing the charge inside and outside the cell. So this pumping mechanism is very, very important, and some poisons work by just stopping this protein from working. So we're going to compare active and passive transport in a second. One thing I didn't talk about is where we have these membrane proteins that just have a hole in the middle. So these are poor proteins. Water travels through cell membranes through this in the large majority of cases. So this protein has a hole in the middle that fits a particular molecule. That molecule can come straight through that hole from one side to the other. And again, this doesn't require energy because we're not pumping anything. We're following the concentration gradient where we have a high concentration outside and a low concentration inside. Let's now compare active and passive transport. So passive transport doesn't require energy from the cell, active transport does. So here we're using ATP to do some pumping. The different types of active and passive transport, so we've got simple diffusion, we've got osmosis, we've got facilitated diffusion where we're using membrane proteins to help the diffusion process along. But again, these don't require energy. With passive transport, we're always moving from a high concentration to a low concentration. So both in diffusion and osmosis. In diffusion, we're looking at higher solute concentration. In osmosis, we're looking at higher water concentration. In active transport, we can move against the concentration gradient. So we can pump things against the flow that they would normally go. So we can take something that's got a high concentration on the outside and pump something out towards it to make that even higher, rather than letting it pass back through diffusion. So today on Flipping Science we looked at diffusion, osmosis and active and passive transport, and we compared them. That's it for Flipping Science today. See ya.